The courthouse stood tall against the morning sky, its marble columns gleaming in the sunlight. Reporters gathered on the steps outside, microphones in hand, whispering predictions about the trial inside. The case had drawn attention from across the nation, not only for the high-profile crime it involved, but also for the unusual role a police dog had played in collecting evidence. By the time the courtroom doors opened, the benches were filled to capacity. Spectators shifted in their seats, adjusting ties and coats, a low murmur of voices creating a tense hum that clung to the air. Inside, the wooden benches creaked under the weight of anxious citizens, family members, and journalists who had secured coveted spots. The judge's bench loomed above, polished to perfection, giving an almost intimidating glow under the harsh lights. Every detail of the room spoke of order and authority, the U.S. flag draped proudly behind the judge, the seal of justice carved into the wall, and the rows of attorneys with their papers neatly stacked like weapons ready for battle. The bailiff, stern and tall, moved briskly between the rows, his presence a reminder that silence and discipline ruled here. On one side of the room sat the prosecution, their expressions grim, yet confident. They had spent weeks building their argument, relying heavily on the testimony of officers and the reliability of a single police dog whose work had cracked open a case that once seemed impossible. The handler of the dog, an officer with broad shoulders and steady eyes, sat close by, the animal curled obediently at his feet. The dog was calm, unmoving, but its presence alone seemed to radiate quiet authority. To the prosecution, it was more than evidence, it was proof of trust between man and animal. On the opposite side, the defense team huddled, flipping through files with hurried precision. Their lead attorney, a sharp-eyed man with graying temples, carried an air of determination mixed with quiet desperation. He knew that if the court accepted the dog's reliability without question, their case would crumble. For weeks, he had sought to prove that the dog was fallible, its instincts unreliable, and its handler prone to error. He leaned close to his colleagues, whispering strategies, his voice low but urgent. To the defense, everything hinged on dismantling the credibility of the animal seated calmly across the aisle. The audience could feel the clash before it even began. To them, this was more than a legal proceeding. It was a battle of narratives. Some spectators whispered about the victims who deserved justice, while others questioned whether a dog's nose could truly decide a human's fate. A woman in the front row clutched a folded tissue, her hands trembling with emotion, while an elderly man leaned forward, eager to catch every word. The reporters, poised with notepads and cameras, waited to capture the story that would dominate headlines by evening. Then, just as the judge's gavel struck, announcing order, a door at the back of the courtroom opened quietly. Heads turned. A young woman stepped in, her face pale, her arms wrapped protectively around a tiny figure clinging to her hip. At first, few paid attention. Families often attended trials, but within moments, whispers spread like wildfire. It was a child. A little girl, no older than 3, with her hair tied in pigtails and a small stuffed bunny in her grasp. She looked impossibly out of place in the severe, tense environment of the courtroom. Her mother guided her carefully down the aisle, every step drawing more curious stares. The defense attorneys glanced up briefly, puzzled, while the prosecution exchanged wary looks. Even the judge's eyes narrowed slightly in question. Children were rarely seen in trials, let alone one as public as this. The bailiff, though trained never to break composure, tilted his head as if silently asking whether her presence was expected. The answer, however, was not immediately clear. The toddler's big brown eyes scanned the room with innocent curiosity. She seemed fascinated by the polished wood of the benches, the strange clothing the adults wore, and the flickering bulbs of cameras. She tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering something that made the woman nod reassuringly. In her small hand, the stuffed toy dangled loosely, its faded ears brushing against the floor as she walked. Though her presence was quiet, it shifted the energy in the courtroom in a way no one could quite explain. The judge struck the gavel again, clearing his throat. This is a courtroom, not a spectacle. All attendees are reminded to remain silent unless called upon. His tone was sharp, but his eyes lingered a moment longer on the small girl before returning to the matter at hand. Yet, as the trial began to unfold, the child remained a silent thread woven into the background of tension. Her mother took a seat, clutching her daughter tightly on her lap, while those around them stole glances, unable to ignore the striking contrast. Where the adults carried tension, she carried innocence. Where every lawyer prepared to strike with words, she sat still, unknowing, her presence oddly calming and unsettling at the same time. On the floor, the police dog shifted slightly, its ears twitching as though it had sensed something beyond the human drama. Its handler leaned down, whispering softly to reassure the animal, unaware that soon the dog and the child would share a moment that would eclipse every legal argument. For now, though, the trial pressed on. The prosecution opened with a confident voice, painting the defendant as guilty beyond doubt, recounting the evidence uncovered by the dog. Their words were sharp, echoing across the walls with conviction. The defense responded fiercely, casting shadows of doubt, emphasizing the fallibility of animals, and the stakes of allowing one's instincts to carry such weight in a court of law. The clash of voices, the shuffle of papers, the scribble of pens, all filled the room with a symphony of tension. Yet amid it all, the child remained, occasionally fidgeting with her toy, occasionally gazing at the dog with wide-eyed fascination. Those who noticed her couldn't help but wonder, why was she here? And what role, if any, could she possibly play in this monumental case? By the end of that first morning session, the courtroom was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Everyone expected the spark to come from a lawyer's argument, a witness's slip, or a piece of overlooked evidence. No one, neither the judge, the attorneys, nor the spectators, could have imagined that it would come instead from the smallest person in the room. And as the child leaned forward in her mother's lap, eyes locked on the police dog resting quietly across the aisle, fate quietly began to shift. The story of the trial was about to take a turn none of them could have predicted, and it all began with the simple, unassuming presence of a toddler in a room full of hardened adults. The stakes in the courtroom were higher than anyone outside could fully comprehend. What unfolded within those polished walls wasn't just about one defendant, one police dog, or one case. It was about justice itself, about trust in the system, about whether truth could be proven by something that couldn't speak like a human, but whose instincts were sharper than any witness on the stand. The case had begun months earlier when police were called to investigate a series of crimes that had rattled the community. A neighborhood once known for its safety had been gripped by fear. A string of break-ins, escalating to violent assaults, had shaken residents. Locks were reinforced, security cameras purchased, neighbors formed watch groups, but the suspect had remained elusive. The community demanded justice, and when an arrest was finally made, the police department promised they had their man. But what tied the accused to the crimes wasn't the usual smoking gun evidence. It was the work of a police canine. A German shepherd named Rex. Rex had tracked scents from a crime scene, located hidden objects that investigators had missed, and even identified a critical piece of clothing buried in the woods. To the officers, Rex wasn't just a dog, he was a partner, a hero who had done what human officers couldn't. But in the courtroom, feelings of loyalty and admiration held no sway. Here, only the law mattered, and the law demanded proof. The prosecution argued that Rex's findings were reliable. They pointed to his years of training, his flawless record, and the testimony of his handler, Officer Daniels, a man with 15 years on the force and a spotless record of service. They claimed that Rex's actions had directly led to the recovery of evidence that tied the defendant to the crime. Without Rex, the case might have remained unsolved. With him, they had certainty. The defense, however, saw things differently. To them, Rex wasn't a hero, he was a liability. They argued that dogs could be influenced by their handlers, that they weren't infallible, and that relying on their instincts in matters of law was dangerous. To undermine the prosecution, they pointed to cases across the country where canine evidence had been challenged or overturned. A dog cannot testify, the defense attorney declared in his opening statement, and yet the state wants you to trust his instincts over human reason. Is that justice or blind faith? The public, watching closely, was deeply divided. Some saw Rex as a symbol of loyalty and protection, a guardian whose very presence gave comfort to families afraid to walk the streets. Others worried about what it meant if the justice system allowed a dog's actions to hold the weight of evidence. Could justice truly be blind if it relied on the nose of an animal? Reporters covering the case leaned into these questions, knowing they made headlines. Trusting justice to a dog's nose? One paper asked. Hero K9 or questionable witness? Another headline read. Talk shows debated the issue, with experts on both sides presenting passionate arguments. The trial became more than just about guilt or innocence. It became a referendum on the very tools of justice itself. In the midst of all this, emotions ran high. Families of victims sat in the front rows, clutching photographs and whispering prayers for justice. They believed in Rex. They believed in the officers who had brought the suspect to trial. For them, this wasn't about legal philosophy. It was about closure, about feeling safe again in their own homes. Across the aisle, the defendant's family sat equally tense. A mother with weary eyes, a father who looked both angry and afraid, siblings who avoided reporters' cameras. To them, Rex wasn't a hero, he was a threat. They insisted their loved one was innocent, that mistakes had been made, that one animal's instincts could not be allowed to decide the fate of a human being. Their lawyer had drilled the point over and over again. Dogs are not machines, and even the best can be wrong. The judge, seated high above it all, carried the weight of these arguments. Though impartial, he knew the eyes of the nation were upon him. His rulings, his reactions, even the tone of his voice would be scrutinized. He had presided over many trials in his career, but this one carried a peculiar complexity. Never before had he seen a case where the credibility of a dog might decide a verdict. And though the law had guidelines, there was little precedent for such a case at this level of attention. As testimony unfolded, Officer Daniels spoke with conviction about Rex's abilities. He described the years of training, the countless hours spent building trust between man and dog, the drills, the tests, the real-life rescues where Rex had saved lives. His words carried weight, and his voice cracked once when he spoke of Rex as more than just a partner. He's family, he said simply. Many in the audience were moved, but the defense was quick to remind the court that emotion was not evidence. Experts were brought in, some supporting the reliability of police dogs, others casting doubt on their scientific accuracy. Charts were displayed, research cited, statistics debated. The prosecution hammered home Rex's spotless record. The defense countered with stories of mistakes in other jurisdictions. Each side fought fiercely, but beneath it all, the room was heavy with something more than legal tension. It was the awareness that the case represented something larger than itself. It was this atmosphere, this battleground of emotion, logic, loyalty, and law that made the toddler's eventual presence so shocking. To those watching from the outside, her arrival seemed irrelevant, even absurd. What role could a 3-year-old play in such a complex trial? But those who sat in the courtroom that day would later describe a feeling, a strange intuition. that the child's appearance meant something, that her innocence stood in stark contrast to the weight of the arguments being made. For now, though, the spotlight remained firmly on Rex, his calm demeanor, the steady rise and fall of his chest as he lay quietly beside Officer Daniels, became a silent presence that influenced the room in ways words never could. Some spectators found themselves watching him more than the witnesses, as though waiting for him to react, to validate, or disprove what was being said. Even the toddler, sitting quietly with her mother, couldn't keep her eyes off the dog. The trial was about evidence, about guilt or innocence, about whether a man would spend years behind bars or walk free. But more than that, it had become about faith in science, faith in animals, faith in justice. It was about whether society could balance logic with trust, rules with instinct, and whether sometimes truth was found not in complex arguments, but in the simplest observations. By the end of the second day, the weight of the case was felt by everyone. The lawyers' voices grew sharper, the audience's silence heavier, the air thicker with anticipation. No one could predict how it would end, only that the outcome would ripple far beyond the walls of the courthouse. And in that charged atmosphere, where every word mattered and every gesture was dissected, one little girl sat swinging her legs, her gaze fixed on a police dog whose role was more contested than any humans in the room. She did not know it yet, but soon her voice, soft, innocent, and unexpected, would pierce through the arguments of adults and leave an indelible mark on the story of justice itself. The morning sun had shifted, pouring thin beams of light through the tall courtroom windows, but inside the atmosphere remained heavy, almost suffocating. The air was thick with arguments, objections, and carefully rehearsed testimonies. People leaned forward in their seats, taking in every word from lawyers and witnesses. Yet, for all the preparation, no one was ready for what happened next. The bailiff, stern as always, opened a side door. At first, most thought it was routine, a witness being escorted in, another person called to testify. But as the door creaked open, heads turned. Instead of a seasoned expert or a nervous civilian, a small figure appeared, clutching the hand of a woman who looked equally anxious and determined. A child. The child's presence caused an immediate ripple of murmurs. The judge's gavel struck once, a sharp command for silence, but curiosity hung in the air. Why was a toddler here? It was almost unthinkable. Trials were arenas of seriousness and precision. Children belonged at playgrounds, not under the solemn gaze of a federal judge. The little girl clung tightly to her mother's side, her tiny feet padding softly against the marble floor as they walked down the aisle. She couldn't have been more than 3, maybe 4 at best. Her hair was tied neatly in 2 small pigtails, each secured with a bright ribbon that looked painfully out of place amid the grim suits and dark dresses of the courtroom. In her hand, she carried a stuffed bunny whose ears were frayed from years of affection. Reporters' pens froze mid-sentence. Spectators craned their necks. Even the defendant, who had seemed detached throughout much of the trial, looked up with genuine surprise. The toddler's wide eyes scanned the room, not with fear, but with wonder. To her, the towering wooden benches and stern faces must have seemed like some grand theater. The judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Counselor," he said slowly, his voice carrying both authority and a hint of disbelief, "what exactly is the meaning of this?" The prosecution exchanged glances, shaking their heads. They had not orchestrated this. All eyes fell on the defense. The lead attorney, unflappable until now, rose to his feet. His voice was calm, but there was a glint of strategy in his eyes. "Your Honor," he began, "this child may not offer testimony in the traditional sense, but her presence is relevant, and we believe the court should allow her to be here." Gasps spread across the room. The idea seemed outrageous. The judge adjusted his glasses, staring hard at the defense attorney, then at the small girl, who was now half hidden behind her mother's leg. "This is highly irregular," he said. "Children do not testify in trials of this magnitude." The defense attorney nodded respectfully. "I understand, Your Honor, but the court is here to seek truth. Sometimes truth reveals itself in unexpected ways." The judge fell silent for a moment. His years on the bench had taught him to expect almost anything, but this was different. He weighed the risks, the spectacle this might cause, the precedent it might set. Finally, he sighed. "Proceed," he said at last, "but I remind everyone in this courtroom, order must be maintained." The bailiff gestured toward the front, and the young mother carefully led her daughter to the witness stand. The child, too small for the chair, was lifted up gently so she could sit, her stuffed bunny clutched tightly against her chest. Her legs swung freely, not even close to reaching the floor. The sight drew a collective hush from the audience. For the first time since the trial began, the atmosphere shifted. The defense attorney approached slowly, mindful not to frighten her. He knelt so he was at eye level, his stern expression softening into a kind smile. "Hello there," he said gently. "What's your name?" The little girl looked at him, then at her mother, then back at him. Her voice, small but clear, carried easily in the silent room. "Maya," she said. The attorney nodded. "That's a lovely name, Maya." He glanced toward the judge, who remained impassive, then back to the child. "Maya, do you know why you're here today?" The girl tilted her head. "Mommy said I just have to be brave." The audience shifted uncomfortably, hearts caught between the seriousness of the trial and the innocence of the child's words. Some spectators smiled faintly, while others frowned, questioning the ethics of involving someone so young. But Maya herself seemed unfazed. For several minutes, the attorney asked simple, harmless questions: her favorite color, her favorite toy, whether she liked animals. The courtroom relaxed slightly, though the judge's gaze remained sharp, ready to end the experiment if it strayed too far. Most assumed the defense was attempting a stunt, softening the jury's hearts, painting a picture of innocence to contrast with the prosecution's hardened narrative. But then, something unexpected happened. As Maya answered another question, her gaze drifted across the room. She spotted Rex, the police dog, lying obediently at Officer Daniel's feet. Her words faltered mid-sentence. Her eyes widened. She let out a quiet gasp, the kind of sound only a child could make when delight and surprise mix perfectly. She raised her small finger and pointed directly at the German Shepherd. The dog, sensing her attention, lifted its head slightly, ears perking up. For a long moment, the two locked eyes. The courtroom froze. No one moved. No one spoke. The defense attorney blinked, thrown off script. The prosecution stiffened, their confidence shaken by the sudden unpredictability of the moment. Reporters poised their pens, sensing history in the making. The judge leaned forward ever so slightly, as if unwilling to miss a single detail. Maya's mother whispered urgently for her to sit still, but the child ignored her. Her hand remained pointed, her eyes still fixed on the dog. The stuffed bunny slipped slightly from her grip, dangling precariously, but she didn't notice. Her focus was entirely on Rex. And then, with the innocence only a toddler could carry into such a solemn place, she opened her mouth to speak. The silence in the courtroom grew unbearable. Hearts raced. Every lawyer, every spectator, every member of the press leaned forward, breath caught in anticipation. What could a 3-year-old possibly say that mattered here, in this grand battle of justice? No one knew yet. But in that instant, everyone understood one thing. Whatever came out of her mouth would not be forgotten. The atmosphere had changed completely. The trial, once dominated by logic and procedure, now rested in the hands of a child who had no knowledge of laws, no grasp of strategy, and no agenda, but truth as she saw it. Her voice was soft, but her words, when they came, would carry weight enough to shake the very foundations of the courtroom. And though no one could see it yet, this was the moment where the trial would begin to turn, not because of an argument, not because of evidence, but because a toddler had looked at a police dog and decided to speak. The courtroom had seen its share of surprises before, but never one quite like this. For years, the judge had presided over trials filled with hardened criminals, tearful witnesses, furious lawyers, and even unruly outbursts that had required order to be restored. But nothing compared to the sight of a 3-year-old child sitting in the witness chair, legs too short to reach the ground, swinging back and forth as if she were perched at a playground rather than the center of a legal battlefield. Maya clutched her stuffed bunny tightly, the worn fabric comforting against her small hands. She hummed softly under her breath, seemingly unaware of the grave silence that surrounded her. Her pigtails bobbed as she shifted in her seat, glancing curiously at the people in dark suits. The adults, stiff and solemn, could not have looked more foreign to her playful world of toys and bedtime stories. The judge sat with his fingers steepled, his gaze sharp but not unkind. He, like everyone else, recognized the stark contrast the child brought into the room. For hours, the trial had been filled with tense arguments, sharp exchanges, and endless objections. Lawyers sparred with words as though wielding swords, and jurors scribbled notes with furrowed brows. Yet now, as Maya sat swinging her legs, the atmosphere seemed momentarily transformed. Some spectators smiled faintly at her innocence, while others shifted uncomfortably, as though unsure whether such purity belonged in a place so burdened with grief and accusation. For the victims' families, the child was a reminder of what had been lost, the innocence ripped away by the crimes at the heart of the case. For the defendant's family, she was an unwelcome distraction, a potential tool for sympathy that could sway emotions against their loved one. The lawyers, too, were uncertain how to proceed. The defense attorney had introduced her presence with bold confidence, but even he seemed caught off guard by the way she commanded attention without saying a word. The prosecution whispered furiously among themselves, debating whether to object further, but something in the air made them hesitate. They knew the optics of challenging a toddler were dangerous. Any move too harsh would backfire with the jury. And then there was Rex. The German shepherd lay quietly at Officer Daniel's feet, his glossy coat gleaming under the overhead lights. He had been still for much of the trial, his presence both symbolic and practical, a reminder of the evidence he had uncovered. But when Maya's gaze locked on him, something shifted. The dog's ears twitched, his head lifting slightly as though drawn by some invisible string. His calm brown eyes met hers, and in that silent exchange, something unexplainable passed between them. The adults noticed it too. The handler straightened subtly, his hand brushing the dog's collar. The jurors leaned forward without realizing it, sensing an invisible thread of connection forming between child and animal. The spectators stilled, holding their breath. And in that suspended moment, innocence and duty collided in a way no one could ignore. Maya tilted her head curiously, her lips curling into a small smile. To her, the dog wasn't a symbol of evidence or justice. He wasn't the subject of heated debate or endless cross-examinations. To her, Rex was just a dog's soft ears, kind eyes, a creature she instinctively trusted. She had no notion of the weight he carried in this trial. All she saw was a friend. "Do you like animals, Maya?" The defense attorney asked gently, sensing the shift. She nodded quickly, her voice carrying brightly in the silent courtroom. "Oh, I like puppies. And bunnies." She lifted her stuffed toy proudly, showing it to the jury as though it were the most important piece of evidence in the world. A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the room. quickly hushed by the judge's glare. But even he could not entirely hide the faint twitch of amusement at the corner of his mouth. "And do you see an animal here today?" The attorney pressed softly. Maya's eyes returned to Rex. She pointed again, this time without hesitation, her small finger steady. "Him." The tension returned instantly. Every lawyer froze. Every juror leaned closer. Every spectator felt the air tighten once more. The contrast between the child's innocent declaration and the adult's suffocating seriousness was overwhelming. The prosecution shifted uneasily, whispering objections under their breath, but refraining from speaking them aloud. The dog remained. Still, his gaze locked on the child, as though he understood that her presence was not ordinary. The judge's voice broke the silence. "Young lady," he said, his tone surprisingly gentle, "do you know that dog's name?" Maya shook her head. "No, that's Rex," the judge explained softly. "He's here because he helps people." Her eyes widened slightly, her small mouth forming an O of wonder. She looked back at Rex, studying him with renewed interest, as though this new knowledge elevated him from a simple dog to something far greater. She hugged her stuffed bunny tighter, the fabric pressed against her cheek. The contrast was almost unbearable. The lawyers had spent weeks tearing at each other with arguments, building and dismantling cases like architects at war. They had spoken of DNA, scent trails, probabilities, and reliability. Yet here was a child, unburdened by strategy or agenda, seeing only what was in front of her, a dog who looked kind. And it was in that purity of perspective that the courtroom felt something shift. Rex was no longer just a piece of evidence. He was no longer just an animal whose instincts were being questioned. Through the eyes of Maya, he became something else entirely, a living being with loyalty, honesty, and perhaps even truth shining in his gaze. The audience felt it in their bones. Some reached for tissues without realizing why. Others leaned back with heavy sighs, struggling to reconcile the innocence before them with the gravity of the case. The judge, though careful to maintain order, allowed the moment to linger. He saw what everyone else saw, the collision of two worlds, one heavy with law and consequence, the other light with wonder and sincerity. The defense attorney, sensing the moment's weight, stepped back, allowing the silence to deepen. It was no longer about what he could argue. It was about what the jury saw, what they felt. And what they saw was a child pointing at a dog, bridging a gap no lawyer could ever cross. For several long moments, no one spoke. The only sound was Maya's soft giggle, as Rex tilted his head, his ears perked in quiet acknowledgement. The innocence of it was disarming, even humbling. Then the judge cleared his throat, his voice firm once more. "We will proceed," he said, though even he seemed to struggle to pull the room back into its rigid order. But the damage, or perhaps the blessing, had already been done. The child's innocence had cut through the suffocating tension, reminding everyone present of something they had forgotten. Beyond the walls of the courtroom, beyond the laws and procedures, life was simple. Trust was simple. Truth, in its purest form, was simple. And though no one realized it yet, the most powerful moment of the trial had not even arrived. Maya's words, two tiny syllables that would soon escape her lips, were waiting. And when they came, they would echo louder than any gavel, louder. And any closing statement, louder than any ruling the court had ever given. The innocence of a child had already cracked the walls of tension. Soon, it would shatter them completely. The courtroom, though silent, vibrated with a strange electricity. Every pair of eyes, judge, jury, lawyers, and spectators remained, locked on the tiny figure perched in the witness chair, and the large German shepherd lying still at the officer's feet. A gulf of tension stretched between them, waiting to be crossed. Maya shifted in her seat, clutching her stuffed bunny against her chest. Her wide, unblinking eyes were fixed on Rex. The little girl didn't see what the adults saw. To her, there was no trial, no defendant, no intricate dance of arguments between prosecution and defense. All she saw was a dog with kind eyes. A dog who reminded her of storybook heroes that protected princesses and chased away bad dreams. The defense attorney glanced nervously at the judge, then crouched a little closer to the child. "Maya," he said gently, "would you like to say hello to Rex?" A murmur rippled through the audience. The prosecutor was on his feet instantly, objecting. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The child has no bearing on." The judge raised a hand. "Sit down, counselor." His eyes flicked back to Maya, then to Rex, who sat quietly, ears alert but body calm. "Let's see where this goes." The room tensed again. The defense attorney smiled warmly at Maya. "You don't have to be scared. He's very friendly. Do you think you could say hi?" Maya didn't answer right away. She slid off the oversized witness chair with some difficulty, her shoes scraping against the polished floor. The bailiff moved forward instinctively, as though to stop her, but the judge's slight nod kept everyone still. All eyes tracked the small figure as she began the long walk across the courtroom. Each step echoed. The jurors leaned forward, unable to look away. Even the defendant, who had until now sat stone-faced and tense, shifted in his chair with an expression caught somewhere between confusion and curiosity. The prosecutor folded his arms tightly, his lips pressed into a hard line, but even he could not hide his interest in what would happen next. Rex remained still, though his eyes followed her. The German shepherd was trained for discipline, to ignore distractions, to remain a pillar of calm in chaos. But the tilt of his head betrayed his awareness that this was no ordinary moment. When Maya stopped a few feet away, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. She stared at him, her head tilted just as his was. It was as if they were studying one another, two beings from different worlds sharing a private understanding in the middle of a crowded stage. "Hi," Maya whispered finally. Her voice was soft, almost swallowed by the vast chamber, but in the silence it rang clear. Rex blinked. Then, as if in answer, he gave a small wag of his tail. The spectators exhaled audibly. A soft chuckle escaped from someone in the back row. Even the judge leaned slightly forward, as though unwilling to miss a single detail. Maya giggled, covering her mouth with her tiny hand. "He wagged at me," she exclaimed, her voice louder this time. The childlike innocence of her words struck deeper than any closing argument could have. Jurors smiled despite themselves. The officer at Rex's side blinked rapidly, fighting back a rush of emotion he could not fully explain. He had trained with the dog for years, trusted him with his life, and yet in this moment it was as if Rex had chosen to reveal a gentler, hidden side only the child could see. The defense attorney seized the moment, his tone gentle, calculated not to break the fragile thread of magic that hung in the air. "Maya," he said softly, "do you think Rex is a good dog?" She nodded without hesitation. "He's a very good dog." The simple certainty in her voice washed over the room like a balm. Jurors shifted uncomfortably, wrestling with emotions they had been trained to set aside. The prosecution scribbled furiously on notepads, but it was clear that no words could erase the impression the little girl had just created. Maya, oblivious to the storm raging in adult minds, inched closer. She stopped just within reach of Rex. The dog, trained to remain still, sat patiently, his dark eyes never leaving her face. Slowly, she stretched out her tiny hand. Her fingers, trembling but determined, hovered above his head. For a split second, everyone wondered, would Rex move? Would he break training? Then he lowered his head. Softly, deliberately, he pressed his muzzle into her small palm. The courtroom gasped as one. It wasn't a bark or a growl, or even a simple acknowledgement. It was a gesture of trust, of surrender, of connection. The hardened German shepherd, trained for duty and discipline, had chosen in that moment to respond to a child with pure, unguarded affection. Maya squealed with delight, dropping her stuffed bunny in the process. "He likes me," she cried. Her laughter filled the courtroom like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The sound was disarming. Lawyers forgot their arguments. Jurors forgot their notes. For a moment, the courtroom was no longer about guilt or innocence, about legal battles or technicalities. It was about a bond simple, human, undeniable. The defense attorney stood frozen, realizing the impact of what had just happened. The prosecution shuffled uncomfortably, their carefully built case suddenly vulnerable to something no cross-examination could dismantle: raw emotion. Even the judge, normally a fortress of composure, allowed a long pause before clearing his throat. His voice, though steady, betrayed a subtle warmth. "It appears," he said, "that Rex has made a new friend." Laughter rippled gently through the courtroom, breaking the tension for the first time in days. But what no one realized was that this was only the beginning. The moment, though powerful, was not yet complete. The child had pointed. A child had reached out. But what came next would not just soften hearts, it would shatter the trial's trajectory. Maya bent down and retrieved her bunny. She hugged it tightly again, still grinning at Rex. Then she looked back at the adults, at the jury, the lawyers, the judge, and her smile faded into something more serious, though her expression remained pure. Innocence had already broken through the walls of procedure, and in a few seconds, with just 2 words, she would tilt the scales of justice in a way no one could have predicted. The courtroom had grown strangely alive, though not with sound. It was alive with expectation, with the heavy, electric stillness that descends before lightning strikes. Everyone's eyes stayed locked on the little girl who had just stroked the police dog's head, her tiny hand resting against his warm fur, as though they had known each other for years. Maya clutched her stuffed bunny again, her pigtails swaying as she tilted her head. Rex sat calmly before her, his tail giving the occasional quiet thump against the floor. To the jurors, it was astonishing a child who should have been terrified in this intimidating chamber seemed completely at ease in the dog's presence. The defense attorney shifted uneasily, waiting, hoping for something profound to happen. The prosecutor leaned forward, pen poised, ready to object at the first sign of irrelevance. Even the judge's gavel rested lightly in his hand, prepared to restore order should this innocent encounter turn chaotic. But no one was prepared for what came next. Maya pointed her tiny finger straight at Rex, her eyes widening with the kind of clarity only children seem to possess. And then, in a voice clear enough for every soul in the room to hear, she said 2 words: "Good boy." The words were small, almost laughably simple, but they landed with the weight of a hammer. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The room froze as though time itself had been stunned into silence. And then it began. The soft gasp from a juror, the sharp intake of breath from the prosecution table, the faint rustle of papers as a spectator dropped his notepad in disbelief. Good boy. 2 words, yet they rang louder than any legal argument that had been made in the past week of proceedings. The officer's eyes brimmed with unexpected tears. He had trained Rex for years, trusted him on countless dangerous calls, but to hear that pure, unfiltered recognition from the lips of a child, it felt like validation, not only of Rex's service, but of his soul. Jurors exchanged glances, some smiling faintly, others blinking hard to hold back sudden emotion. In those 2 words, Maya had done what lawyers had been battling to achieve for days. She had humanized the evidence. She had reminded them all that Rex wasn't just a piece of equipment or a technicality in a legal case. He was a living, breathing, trustworthy being. The prosecutor stood abruptly, his voice sharp with desperation. Your Honor, this is theatrics. This has no bearing on the case. The judge didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Maya, watching her with an expression that betrayed his struggle to remain impartial. For years he had listened to testimonies filled with lies, half-truths, and manipulations. Yet here was a child, with no agenda, no ulterior motive, speaking two of the truest words he had ever heard. Finally, the judge spoke, his tone calm but firm. Sit down, counselor. The court will decide what weight to give the child's words. The prosecutor hesitated, then sank slowly back into his chair, his jaw tight. He knew the damage had already been done. Maya, oblivious to the eruption she had caused, leaned closer to Rex again. Good boy, she repeated, this time softer, almost like a secret shared between friends. Rex's ears perked, and he wagged his tail once more, the sound of it against the floor loud in the silent room. The defense attorney cleared his throat, his voice trembling as he addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes truth is not complicated. Sometimes it isn't buried in evidence files or expert testimony. Sometimes it comes in the clearest, most innocent form imaginable. Out of the mouths of children. Objection rang out again, but it was half-hearted this time. The prosecution knew they were losing the jury, losing them to a moment that could never be erased from memory. The jurors scribbled notes, but their faces revealed what their pens could not hide. They had been moved. They had been touched in a way no lawyer's words could undo. The spectators whispered among themselves, their voices hushed with awe. Did you hear what she said? One woman murmured. She just looked at him and knew. And that was the truth Maya hadn't analyzed, she hadn't debated, she hadn't questioned. She had simply looked into Rex's eyes and recognized goodness. The judge called for order, but his voice carried less authority than usual. The truth was, he too had been moved. He tapped his gavel lightly, more to collect himself than to silence the room. When the noise settled, he leaned forward slightly. Maya, he said gently, why do you think Rex is a good boy? The little girl blinked up at him, surprised by the question. She hugged her bunny tightly, thought for a moment, then shrugged in that simple, honest way only children could. Because he just is. You can tell. Her words, naive yet piercing, swept through the courtroom like a fresh wind. There was no strategy in them, no polish, no rehearsed testimony. Just truth. The defense attorney let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He had gambled on the child's presence, but never in his wildest calculations had he expected it to strike so deeply, so universally. The prosecutor scribbled notes furiously, determined to claw back control when his turn came. But he knew deep down that the trial had shifted irreversibly. The officer knelt beside Rex, placing a steadying hand on the dog's back. His voice cracked slightly as he whispered, "You've always been a good boy. Haven't you, partner?" Rex wagged again, his loyalty shining as brightly as ever. The moment hung in the air, suspended, unshakable. Everyone in the room understood. They had just witnessed something that could not be explained by rules of evidence or legal precedent. It was raw, unfiltered truth delivered by the purest witness imaginable. Good boy. 2 words, yet they carried the power to soften hardened hearts. To remind even the most skeptical juror that truth sometimes comes, not through science or strategy, but through the undeniable instinct of innocence. The judge finally called a recess, his gavel striking with more gentleness than force. The room erupted into whispers as people rose from their seats, unable to stop replaying the moment in their minds. Maya skipped back to her family, clutching her stuffed bunny, unaware that she had just shifted the direction of an entire trial. To her, she had only spoken the truth as she saw it. She had only said what her heart told her. But to everyone else, those 2 words would echo long after the trial ended. The balance had tipped, and the ripples of Maya's innocent declaration were only beginning to spread. The gavel's sound, though gentle, marked the first pause in a courtroom that had been electrified by a child's simple words. "Good boy." 2 syllables, yet their impact reverberated across every corner of the chamber, touching minds and hearts alike. What had been a space dominated by strategy, evidence, and procedure now vibrated with emotion, a reminder that truth sometimes transcends paperwork and legal jargon. The jury sat frozen, pens poised mid-air. They were trained to weigh evidence impartially, to set aside emotion and focus on facts. But what they had witnessed could not easily be dismissed. A toddler, entirely unaware of the complex ramifications of her words, had looked at a police dog and declared his goodness. That statement carried weight no witness, no report, no chart could rival. It was instinct, purity, and honesty, all rolled into a moment that demanded acknowledgement. One juror, a middle-aged woman with years of courtroom experience, pressed her hand to her chest. She could feel her heartbeat racing. The calm, calculated world of legal analysis she had carried into the trial now felt fragile, disrupted by the simple truth of a child's observation. She exchanged glances with her fellow jurors, seeing in them the same conflicted emotions: surprise, wonder, and an undeniable recognition that the case had changed. At the prosecution table, whispered discussions erupted. The lead attorney's confidence, built meticulously over weeks of preparation, wavered. His voice, usually commanding, dropped to a near whisper as he muttered to his colleagues. Did she just... He paused, swallowing hard. That could sway them. Indeed, it could. Every juror had witnessed not only the child's words, but the way the police dog had responded to them, ears perking, tail giving the tiniest wag, a living affirmation of her instinctive judgment. Even the most skeptical minds were struggling to reconcile the dog's reliability with the innocence that had just judged him. The defense attorney, sensing a strategic shift, allowed a small, satisfied smile to touch his face. This had been his gamble, introducing the child as a witness in the broadest sense, not to testify about the crime itself, but to reveal a layer of truth that adults could not see. Now, the gamble had paid off in ways no one could have predicted. The defendant, who had sat rigid and detached through most of the trial, now slumped slightly in his chair. His eyes softened, betraying the humanity beneath his anxiety and anger. He had watched Maya's interaction, the innocence she brought, and for the first time, he felt a strange mix of hope and relief. Perhaps this small gesture would temper the harshness of a courtroom he had feared could condemn him unfairly. Even spectators, journalists, and onlookers felt the moment. Pens stopped mid-scribble. Cameras rested on tripods. Conversations, hushed at first, spread in waves of astonishment. Reporters whispered to one another, aware that they had captured a scene that would dominate headlines far beyond the trial's official record. Social media would erupt with stories of a child's interaction with a police dog, a moment of innocence piercing the usual barrage of crime and legal jargon. The courtroom itself seemed to breathe differently. The walls, lined with solemn wood panels and the weight of legal tradition, felt lighter. Tension, once thick enough to touch, was replaced with a quiet awe. Something in the room had shifted, and everyone knew it. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Order," he said, though his voice lacked the usual steel. Even he had felt the power of the child's words and their immediate resonance. He leaned back in his chair, carefully weighing how to proceed. "Let us continue," he said finally, though even his tone suggested acknowledgement of what had transpired, that sometimes truth presents itself in forms we do not expect. Officer Daniels, the handler of Rex, crouched slightly to speak softly to his partner. "You've never looked more like yourself than you did just now," he whispered. Rex blinked slowly, his head resting against the officer's knee, responding as though he understood the enormity of the moment. The prosecution's next witness entered, attempting to return the trial to its logical rhythm. Documents were presented, cross-examinations began, charts displayed, statistics read aloud. But the courtroom's attention had shifted. Jurors heard the testimony, but their minds could not escape the simple, resonant words of a child. "Good boy." That phrase, repeated in their minds like a mantra, colored every judgment, every consideration. Suddenly, Rex was not merely a dog trained to follow commands. He was a symbol of trust, of reliability, of instinct uncorrupted by adult agendas. The evidence he had helped gather could no longer be seen purely through numbers or technicalities. It carried a human, almost sacred weight. The ripple extended even further. Lawyers who had been rivals throughout the trial exchanged fleeting glances, silently acknowledging that the moment had surpassed legal maneuvering. They, too, felt the subtle shift, the power of innocence, the undeniable authority of a truth spoken without calculation. Maya, oblivious to the turmoil she had sparked, continued to giggle softly, still seated beside her mother. She held her bunny close and occasionally glanced back at Rex, who sat patiently. She had no idea of the influence she had unleashed. To her, she had only recognized goodness where she saw it, and uttered the words that came naturally. For some in the courtroom, it was a revelation. Legal precedent, evidence, and strategy suddenly seemed secondary to the profound simplicity of her observation. Could the reliability of a dog truly be questioned when the purest judgment in the room, unbiased, untrained, untainted by experience, had declared him good? By mid-afternoon, the trial had acquired a new rhythm. Arguments continued, but the tension had shifted. Jurors listened differently now, the prosecution's words measured against the child's declaration, the defense emboldened by the new emotional weight. Every point made, every objection raised, now carried the implicit question: would this align with the truth a child could see so clearly? Even outside the courtroom, the story was spreading. Reporters filed instant updates, cameras rolled interviews, social media buzzed with excitement. The tale of a toddler recognizing the goodness in a police dog captivated public imagination. Readers, viewers, and followers marveled at the image of innocence wielding authority over logic, of two small words bringing humanity into a system often dominated by cold facts. The ripple effect was undeniable. Families in the audience, victims' kin, community members, they felt reassured. There was justice here that transcended procedure, a reminder that instinct, morality, and truth could still emerge amid complex adult affairs. And as the day drew to a close, one thing became clear to everyone present. The courtroom had been irrevocably changed. The child had not only observed the dog, she had reshaped the entire trial, inserting a perspective that no amount of debate or evidence could negate. Maya's small voice had become a catalyst for clarity. Innocence had become a guide for judgment. And a courtroom filled with adults had been reminded, painfully and beautifully, of a truth often forgotten. Sometimes the simplest perspective carries the most profound wisdom. By the end of that day, lawyers, jurors, and spectators alike were acutely aware that the outcome of the trial was no longer just about facts or law. It was about trust, instinct, and the ability to recognize goodness when it revealed itself. And it was all because a toddler had uttered two words: "Good boy." The ripple had begun, and no one, no matter how experienced or calculating, could predict where it would reach next. After the midday recess, the courtroom returned to its official rhythm, but something had shifted irreversibly. Jurors who had been skeptical and defensive were now deeply reflective, their minds replaying the child's words, her innocent judgment, and the subtle response of the police dog. Even the most seasoned lawyers, steeped in the strategies and technicalities of law, had to acknowledge the undeniable truth. Maya's observation had pierced the rigid walls of logic and procedure in a way no argument could counter. Officer Daniels adjusted Rex's collar, kneeling beside him, as if to reinforce the unspoken connection between the dog and the child. Rex remained calm, his eyes following Maya whenever she glanced in his direction, ears slightly perked as though he, too, understood the gravity of what had transpired. For him, this was no ordinary courtroom. It was a place where human perception, morality, and instinct converged, and in that space, his years of training and loyalty had been validated not through law, but through innocence. The prosecution attempted to continue, calling witnesses and presenting evidence, but the tone had irrevocably changed. The jurors were no longer passive consumers of facts. They were participants in an emotional and moral dialogue catalyzed by the child's unassuming words. Every piece of evidence was now filtered through a lens they could not shake. How does this align with the truth as observed by someone untainted by bias, ambition, or fear? The defense attorney recognized this subtle yet profound shift. His strategy, originally risky, had succeeded beyond imagination. By bringing Maya into the courtroom, he had introduced a living embodiment of impartial judgment, a perspective so pure that it unsettled assumptions, challenged biases, and subtly influenced every mind in the room. But he knew the final outcome still rested on the jurors' careful deliberation. His role was complete. The rest was up to them. The jury retired to deliberate, leaving the courtroom in an unusual stillness. Usually, such breaks were filled with whispers, lawyers reviewing notes, and spectators speculating endlessly. But today, silence lingered like a tangible force. Even journalists, typically eager to fill every gap with conjecture, paused to reflect on what they had witnessed. A toddler's 2 words had shifted the emotional balance of an entire trial. In the deliberation room, jurors discussed the evidence with renewed clarity. The DNA reports, the surveillance footage, the testimony of witnesses, each was weighed more carefully now, considered not only for technical accuracy, but also in the context of trust and reliability. And when discussions turned to Rex, the dog's actions carried new significance. His instinctive abilities, previously just technical contributions, were now understood as extensions of his integrity and loyalty, qualities affirmed in the pure eyes of a child. Her words, "They made me think differently," one juror admitted quietly. Not just about the dog, but about the evidence, about how we judge things. Another nodded. "It's strange. A child's observation feels more honest than all the arguments we've heard." The room was filled with thoughtful silence, punctuated by occasional murmurs of agreement. Meanwhile, the defendant sat quietly outside the deliberation room, his mind replaying the scene repeatedly. He felt a cautious hope he hadn't dared to feel earlier. Maya's presence had reminded him that even within the rigid structure of law, there existed a human element, a reminder that justice was not merely about conviction or punishment, but about fairness, trust, and understanding. Hours passed as the jury worked through the case. Finally, they returned to the courtroom. The atmosphere was tense, yet subtly different from before. There was no uncertainty about whether their verdict would be impartial, only an acute awareness of the weight of responsibility, not just to the law, but to truth in its broadest sense. The judge, solemn yet visibly moved, addressed the jury. "Have you reached a verdict?" A 4-person rose, her expression serious but calm. "We have, Your Honor." She held the papers in her hands, as if even that action carried weight beyond mere formality. "We find the defendant guilty on the charges substantiated by the evidence, and not guilty where reasonable doubt exists." A hush fell over the courtroom. It was a nuanced verdict, reflective not just of facts, but of the deeper truths the jurors had wrestled with, truths illuminated, at least in part, by the innocent intervention of a child. The defendant's family gasped softly, a mixture of relief and disbelief. The prosecution, while professionally accepting the outcome, could not deny the subtle influence Maya had imparted. Even the judge nodded slightly, acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances that had unfolded. As the court moved toward adjournment, everyone's attention shifted one last time to Maya. She sat quietly, her bunny in her lap, a small smile playing on her lips. She had no idea of the impact she had made, no notion that her 2 words had changed perceptions, softened hearts, and shaped the course of a legal process that had seemed unyielding and rigid. Officer Daniels lifted Rex slightly by the collar, giving a subtle nod of gratitude. "You did good," he whispered to the dog, though the meaning extended far beyond training or duty. Rex wagged his tail in acknowledgement, the bond between dog and officer reaffirmed by a child's pure observation. Reporters outside the courthouse captured the scene with excitement. Headlines would soon proclaim the story that captured the imagination of a nation. How a toddler's simple words brought clarity to a complex trial. How innocence and instinct provided insight that adults had struggled to articulate for months. The public would marvel not just at the verdict, but at the reminder that truth can manifest in the most unexpected ways. Over the following weeks, the story of Maya and Rex became a symbol of hope, empathy, and the extraordinary power of innocence. Children were celebrated for their unfiltered perspective. Police dogs were recognized not just for service, but for their moral influence. And communities reflected on how justice is most effective when it combines both human judgment and instinctive integrity. For the individuals involved, the impact was deeply personal. Jurors spoke of the experience as transformative, a reminder that law and humanity are intertwined. Lawyers, even opponents, acknowledged that the trial had challenged their perceptions and reinforced the importance of empathy in the practice of law. The defendant, though held accountable where evidence was clear, later stated in an interview that the child's presence had reminded him of fairness and compassion amidst the stark realities of the justice system. Maya herself, unaware of the widespread attention she had garnered, continued to live in her small world of play and curiosity. Yet her 2 words, spoken innocently, continued to echo in the memories of those who witnessed them. The courtroom, once tense and formal, had been reminded that even the smallest voice can have the greatest impact when it speaks truth without calculation or prejudice. In the end, the trial was recorded in the annals of legal history, not only for its verdict, but for its extraordinary demonstration of how innocence, clarity, and instinct can intersect with human institutions to illuminate the profound truths often obscured by complexity. A 3-year-old's simple words had reminded everyone present of a timeless lesson. Sometimes, the purest justice is revealed not through arguments, charts, or witness testimony, but through honesty and the ability to see goodness where it exists. As the courthouse emptied and the last of the spectators left, Maya's small hand waved goodbye to Rex. The dog, calm and loyal, gave a quiet wag of his tail. Officer Daniels smiled, knowing that this bond between child, dog, and justice would be remembered far longer than any case file or legal precedent. And somewhere in the quiet aftermath, everyone realized the truth. Justice is not only measured in verdicts and statutes, but also in the courage to recognize goodness, even in the simplest, most unexpected forms. The story of that day would live on, a reminder that even in the gravest of circumstances, innocence has the power to illuminate the heart of truth. And the words, "good boy," spoken by a child no older than 3, would forever echo in the memories of everyone who had been there.